away.
Thank you. Yes, this title is actually different from what's in the program. It's possible there was a certain amount of mission creep between when I submitted the abstract and when I finished writing the talk, as sometimes happens. So the human community, I think we can all agree that human community and in fact, rational agency itself can't exist without a vast store of common ground, shared background beliefs about norms and institutions, but also factual beliefs about the shared world that we inhabit. So once we understand this, we can also see that a central function of any society's epistemic practice has to be what I'm going to call doxastic coordination, which is the production of consensus sufficient to enable community, communication, and fruitful coordination. Now, this conclusion or this recognition is going to have consequences for our understanding of various elements of our epistemic practice. And for example, relevant to this particular workshop, we have to understand that a central function of giving and asking for reasons is to reestablish consensus sufficient for cooperation when such consensus has broken down. I'm going to argue that philosophical considerations of the sort that I've just briefly rehearsed are going to support this conception of the function of reason giving and taking, and that this conception is also supported by empirical research into the evolution of reasoning and how reasoning works in early human development. So I'm going to argue for a particular conception of the function of giving and asking for reasons, and that that function, that argument rests on sort of a prior conception of sort of the aims and ends and function of our epistemic practice. So I'm going to start off by talking about what I think our epistemic practice is for, and then sort of the function of reason giving kind of falls out of that. Okay. So the construction of human society and its institutions requires large-scale doxastic coordination, as I'm going to call it, coordination of beliefs. So Tomasello notes that living in large societies, he says, created the problem of how individuals could coordinate with in-group strangers with whom they had no personal common ground. The solution was the conventionalization of cultural practices. Everyone conformed to what everyone else was doing and expected others to conform as well, and expected them to expect them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This created the kind of cultural common ground that could be assumed of all members of society. So Searle, Tuomola, and others have also written extensively about how basic human institutions such as property, money, et cetera, are created and sustained by shared commitments or other attitudes which presuppose some kind of doxastic coordination around the central elements of these institutions. So an indefinitely large range of shared statuses, knowings that, and knowings how, as well as institutions and other social structures underlie the very possibility of human community. The same is also going to be true of factual belief, not merely of social and institutional belief. So the scope of doxastic coordination of beliefs required for any large-scale cooperative project, such as whatever, the Large Hadron Collider or engineers collaborating on the design of a new car or what have you, is immeasurable. Now, granted, not every single collaborator will share every single commitment. There is, of course, an epistemic division of labor, something that's come up already, and that's part of why you have collaborators in the first place. But an indefinite range of shared commitments, including commitments about whose entitlements to defer to on issues that one doesn't know anything about, necessarily structure such collaboration. So let me talk about just briefly a concrete example of large-scale social coordination, which is enabled by doxastic coordination. So consider, for example, international efforts to eradicate diseases like smallpox and polio. So the success of the polio eradication effort, which was largely accomplished during the 1970s, required, well, for starters, it required smaller, more specialized pools of common belief and knowledge, such as how to create vaccine supply chains, how to implement so-called ring vaccination when an outbreak was detected, and so on. But this success, the success of an effort like this, also required more global doxastic coordination. So it required that the population generally be made knowledgeable about the dangers of the disease, the existence, safety, and effectiveness of the vaccine, measures that can be taken to avoid infection in the first place, and so on. The success of the eradication effort depended on the success of this doxastic coordination. You couldn't have one without the other. That this is true can easily be seen by the failures of current efforts against COVID-19 in many countries, driven largely, one might argue, by disinformation campaigns that inhibit the doxastic coordination necessary for a successful fight against a pandemic. So, doxastic coordination is essential for the existence of human community and for the success of any kind of cooperation. Now, in light of this conclusion, which I hope that none of what I've said so far is super controversial. So in light of this conclusion, I want to examine our epistemic practice, meaning our concrete practice of assigning entitlement or justification to beliefs, assigning more or less epistemic authority to various agents or institutions, designating various methodologies as justification conferring and others as not, and so on. And I'm going to argue that producing doxastic coordination has to be a central function of our epistemic practice. Now, a society's epistemic practice is its practice of doxastic regulation. Basically, it's practice of regulating belief in society. That's its actual practice of assessing people's commitments by epistemic standards and regulating these beliefs in society. Now, this practice has a lot of related dimensions. For starters, it involves assessing individuals as more or less entitled to their individual beliefs or commitments. Maybe you take Jones's word when he talks about carburetors because he's a hobbyist mechanic. Maybe you think Smith doesn't know what he's talking about when he talks about vaccine safety for whatever reason. Intimately related to this is our practice of allocating more or less epistemic authority to various people and various institutions regarding specific subject matter. So again, the reason that you allocate epistemic authority to Jones with respect to carburetors is because he's a mechanic. The reason you trust the World Health Organization with respect to vaccines is because it's an institution of, it's an organization of medical professionals. Okay, so our epistemic practice aims at doxastic regulation of beliefs, but to what end? Like, what is the goal? Like, what is the goal of this regulation of beliefs? Does it aim to produce true beliefs, justified true beliefs? So I'm going to argue that doxastic coordination is among the central aims of our epistemic practice. It has to be. And so I'm going to argue this, I'm going to try to make this plausible by means of an analogy. The analogy is going to be the case of morality. So I take it that I think it's not super controversial that a moral practice can be assessed along two separate dimensions. The first is what you might call the coordination dimension. So this is very explicit in game theoretic discussions of metaethics. A moral practice can only be successful to the extent that it coordinates behavior around an equilibrium point, ideally CC rather than DD. Obviously, a moral practice can fail to secure the needed level of coordination. There can be too many defectors or what have you. So a key purpose of a moral practice is to secure cooperation and hence coordination. But of course, coordination can't be the only dimension along which we assess a moral practice. A society could converge on a highly immoral practice. So a society could be highly coordinated, but terrible, right? So we also evaluate a moral practice not merely on the coordination dimension, but also on what you might call the optimization dimension. So a moral practice serves at least two purposes and can be evaluated along at least two separate dimensions, coordination and optimization. Now, interestingly to me, I think traditional theories of epistemology have taken it that our epistemological theories idealize only along the optimization dimension, where optimization is understood as something like truth or something like that. But I think a moment's reflection is going to show that in epistemological practice, must also be assessed along the coordination dimension. So consider, for example, a traditional objection against coherentism, just to pick a sort of traditional theory of justification. This is the objection, this is the worry about internally coherent belief systems that don't match up with the world. So that's sort of a hoary objection against coherentism. From my point of view, that's actually not the most serious worry about coherentism. The most serious worry about coherentism is the worry about different individuals having internally consistent belief systems that don't match each other's belief systems. What mechanism guarantees coordination of belief systems across members of society? There's nothing intrinsic to coherentism or foundationalism or other individualistic epistemological theories that would vouch for such coordinations. But doxastic coordination cannot be seen as tangential to our epistemic practice. Society, and as I've said, rational agency itself, cannot exist without society's belief-forming mechanisms producing overwhelming doxastic coordination. So a central function of our epistemic practice must be the production of belief coordination. That's one of the key takeaways, I think, from this. Now, there are a lot of different mechanisms by which our epistemic practice does this, thereby securing agreement and doxastic coordination. Expressions deploying overt epistemological terminology, such as knows, are generally exceptional. The overwhelming majority of our epistemic practice, like the overwhelming majority of all normative practice, is implicit in our practical and discursive behavior. So we carry on our epistemic practice. We secure doxastic coordination, for example, through the differential allocation of epistemic authority. So to give you an example, when I defer to a scientist or a textbook author or a car mechanic, then I am implicitly acknowledging this person's entitlement to a certain claim or a set of claims. So if I say that Smith is an expert entomologist, and again, notice there's lots of ways of attributing epistemic status to individuals. And epistemologists' favorite words like knows, justified are probably not the most common. So when I say that Smith is an expert entomologist, then I convey that non-experts such as myself ought to defer to Smith when she, for example, identifies a certain specimen as a rhinoceros beetle or tells me that velvet ants aren't really ants. This allocation, this differential allocation of epistemic authority in society serves the goal of belief coordination in society. So attributing a status like this to Smith involves undertaking a commitment to Smith on this issue. We need to make our beliefs conform to hers. And that's a coordination related issue as much as it is an optimization related issue. Now, examples can be multiplied indefinitely, but I hope the point is clear. Securing doxastic coordination is a central function of our epistemic practice. So, like our moral practice, our epistemic practice idealizes along two dimensions: optimization, getting things right, and coordination, securing agreement. Viewing our epistemic practice through the lens of these two functions or dimensions is going to have significant consequences for understanding various aspects of this practice, including the practice of reason giving. Now, normally we don't consciously formulate reasons for our beliefs. We make intuitive inferences based on reasons that we may only dimly perceive if we perceive them at all. So, here again, I'm going to, as a lot of people have, draw on Mercier and Sperber's work. So to use their example, you might intuit from Molly's facial expression and other clues that she is upset. Now, normally such an intuition is not based on conscious consideration of reasons, nor will there be any conscious process of inference used to arrive at the conclusion that Molly is upset. Okay, so when do we have to engage in reasoning? As Mercier and Sperber say, we often use reasons when our intuitions are challenged by other people or by further experiences. So in such a case, our reasoning is based on meta-representational intuitions about our first order intuitions. So for example, if you ask Molly why she's upset, and she replies, "I'm not upset. Why would you think that I am?" She might reply by saying, "You weren't smiling and your voice sounded strained, and that gave me reason to think you were upset." So now you have a set of meta representations about your first order intuitions, and you're presenting these to her as reasons. Now, of course, Mercier and Sperber, I'll go through this quickly because, again, I don't think any of you need to be told about this. Mercier and Sperber argue that reason serves a primarily social function. So they argue against what they call the intellectualist view, that reason evolved to help individuals draw better inferences, acquire greater knowledge, and make better decisions. There are simply too many features of reason that are incompatible with this intellectualist view and more compatible with the view that reason evolved to serve primarily a social function. So for example, Mercier and Sperber argue that human reasoning displays what they call a my-side bias. We got a treatment of this from yesterday, which actually dissented from this as a good example or a good argument. But nevertheless, I'm going to carry on offering this as an example in support of this thesis. So as they said, reasoning, they argue that reasoning systematically works to find reasons for our ideas and against ideas we oppose. It always takes our side. This is pretty much the exact opposite of what you should expect of a mechanism that aims at improving one's beliefs through solitary ratiocination. Further, although humans often reason poorly as individuals, we tend to reason much better in groups. Mercier and Sperber cite a bit of research which pitted individuals attempting to solve the Wason selection task, which is also something that's been mentioned, against groups who would discuss the task and collectively come to a solution. So individuals engaging in solitary reasoning generally did very poorly, getting the correct answer maybe 15% of the time. Groups who reasoned together solved the task correctly between 50 and 80% of the time. Okay, so if we see doxastic coordination as a central function of our epistemic practice, this puts sociality at the center of our practice of doxastic regulation. Our practice of doxastic regulation should not be seen as a solitary affair, which is carried out by epistemically virtuous but isolated agents. Rather, doxastic regulation is a social affair, and mechanisms for doxastic regulation, such as reasoning and argumentation, are then plausibly understood as social tools rather than as merely tools for individual cognition. Now, viewing our epistemic practice this way supports the broader project of social epistemology. And in particular, it supports a particular conception of why we give and ask for reasons. And that's what I'm going to turn to now. Okay, so I want to take the lessons that from the previous sections, which hopefully I've convinced you that our epistemic practice has to serve this crucial function of doxastic coordination. So I want to apply the lessons of the previous sections specifically to the practice of giving and asking for reasons. So again, as I've said, we have to, we have to view our epistemic practice, including our practice of giving reasons, through these two lenses, through the lens of optimization and the lens of coordination. So we don't, in the ordinary course of events, consciously entertain reasons, much less exchange reasons with each other. But what happens when we do give reasons? In what context do we give reasons, and why are we giving reasons? What function does that serve in this sort of, epistemological economy of a community or an individual? Okay, so in what kind of circumstances do we give reasons? So one use of reasons is retrospective. We often, after the fact, offer reasons to justify our past behavior. That's not what I'm going to worry about here. I'm more interested in what we call prospective use of reasons, reasoning about things before we do something. Now, Mercier and Sperber, as I suppose we all know, argue that argumentative and hence social uses of reasons should be seen as primary in these, especially in these prospective cases. So this is true as far as it goes. Yes, the primary use of reasoning is argumentative, but As David Petraszewski points out, Mercier and Sperber's argument can be taken further. If reasoning is for argument, what is argument for? Why do we argue? What's the use of argument? Well, the account that I'm offering here offers, I hope, an answer to that question. A chief purpose of reason giving will be the creation and maintenance of doxastic coordination. So in fact, the giving of reasons is likely to occur precisely when doxastic coordination is broken down. So for example, when disagreement has arisen. And the giving of reasons should be seen as an attempt to reestablish that agreement. So let me give you just a simple example. Suppose a group of humans on the hunt are tracking game, but disagree about which way the animals have gone. Obviously, the hunt cannot continue until agreement is reestablished. Members of the hunting party can publicly offer reasons such as, see this hoof print, the break in this branch is fresh, to reestablish, if not unanimity, then at least a sufficient threshold of agreement to continue the cooperative task at hand. So really, it can't be overemphasized. Doxastic coordination has to be seen as a central function of our epistemic practice of doxastic regulation. And so the practice of giving and asking for reasons then should be seen as serving a reparative or ameliorative function when there's a rupture or breakdown resulting in disagreement. Okay, so that's what you might consider a philosophical argument for the thinking that reason giving serves this particular reparative or ameliorative function. But I think there's also other kinds of evidence to be offered for this thesis, including empirical evidence, some of which you actually will have already heard in this workshop. So there's empirical evidence in particular for this thesis. So it's been pointed out that communication presupposes a great deal of common ground, namely shared beliefs and values that underpin communicative acts. So Tomasello writes, he gives the following example. He says, our everyday discourse is liberally peppered with seemingly incoherent sequences. For example, me, want to go to a movie tonight? You, I have a test in the morning. For me to interpret your answer as a no, we must share in common ground an understanding that tests require studying beforehand, one cannot study and watch a movie at the same time, and so forth. This common ground then makes possible my abductive leap that you will not be coming with me to the movie. So reason giving often occurs when common ground is absent as a way of establishing or reestablishing common ground so that communication and cooperation are possible. Koyman and Tomasello have done experimental work supporting this claim. There's a couple of studies. Actually, the studies I'm going to talk about are quite similar to studies that Bahar talked about yesterday. So I thought it was interesting to hear about those from directly from her. So let me just give you a couple of examples. So when 3- and 5-year-old pairs are given a cooperative task, one child will offer the other child information in the form of reasons to supply what they judge to be missing information in order to establish common ground so that cooperative action may proceed. Right? So this is one function that reason giving serves, that it serves to establish or reestablish common ground so that joint action, cooperative action can proceed. So Bahar gave examples of these children who are trying to decide how to take care of this creature that's been entrusted to their care, a selk. And so one child might tell the other child, selks eat rocks, and so we need to put rocks in the enclosure. This might be an example of providing information to a conversational partner to thereby ensure common ground and thereby enable joint action. So there's experimental evidence that reason giving serves the goal of doxastic coordination in the form of establishing common ground to enable communication and then joint action. So there's other kinds of example. Andy Norman, he's offered further empirical support. He actually defends a thesis very similar to my own, writing first and foremost, reasoning is for, in the sense that any biological function is for anything, reasoning is for weaving and repairing webs of mutual understanding, for building, extending, and tending to cognitive common ground. So the various supposed failures of reasoning make sense when we see that one chief goal of reasoning is to produce doxastic coordination, broadly understood to include also alignment of intentions and other practical mental states. So, for example, the human tendency to groupthink doesn't make a lot of sense if we view reason as a device for individuals to arrive at the truth, but if we regard reason as aimed in large part at producing consensus or agreement, then this tendency makes perfect sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Okay, now this is, and I think this gets back to Ladislav's paper from yesterday. I think this touches some common points here. Reasoning cannot merely promote agreement. A group whose consensus consistently coalesced around false beliefs is probably not going to survive, right? I mean, again, reasoning, there are these two dimensions by which we assess an epistemic practice, not just coordination, but optimization, right? So reasoning does have to be truth-oriented. It can't merely be consensus-oriented. But as Norman points out, experimental evidence also indicates that collaborative reasoning is surprisingly truth-conducive when oriented toward shared understanding. So as I argued above earlier, our epistemic practice serves these two functions and has to be evaluated along two dimensions, the optimization and coordination dimensions. And it's precisely in group reasoning of the sort discussed here that we see these two dimensions actually converge. So Norman actually offers an example very similar to the one that I offered earlier of primitive hunters. They're trying to find game. They don't know which way the game went, and so they start offering reasons to try to reestablish consensus so the hunt can continue. Norman offers the following. Let me just read his example. He says, notice that Zog is what he names his prehistoric hunter. Notice that Zog's act of, say, pointing out a footprint does more than just shape consensus. It does so around an objectively superior option, because the mammoth print by the river's edge is a reliable indicator of their quarry's location. Zog is promoting a shared and more accurate understanding of the situation. The truth-conducive nature of the evidence indicating act, it is, so to speak, built in. So this again is precisely what you would expect on the present account if the function of our epistemic practice and the role of giving reason giving within the practice is, as I've said, it is. So in other words, this is precisely what you would expect if reason giving evolved for the sake of promoting shared understanding. So it has this consensus and this coordination and this optimization dimension. This is where they converge right here in this sort of group reasoning of the kind that for example, Norman is talking about. So there's one more kind of empirical evidence. And again, this is something that Bahar talked about yesterday, meta-talk, reason giving as meta-talk about reasons. So Koyman and Tomasello have pointed out that once children are a little bit older, say around 5, they can use reasons in the form of meta-talk to produce counter arguments to explain why a partner's reasons for his or her belief are not valid or why their own reasons are more valid. For example, pairs of 5-year-olds were offered the following problem to solve jointly. A girl must walk to school in the rain. Which of these 2 boxes contains the thing she needs? One child in each pair was given 2 additional pieces of information. The umbrella is broken. The boots have polka dots. And so 5-year-olds, as it turns out, will use relevant information, the umbrella is broken, but not irrelevant information, the boots have polka dots, to present reasons against their partner's choice. So reason giving, again, serves the purpose of doxastic coordination aimed at the ultimate end, not only of communication, but of joint action and problem solving. One cannot decide what to do without deciding first on the set of reasons that are decisive. And once these reasons have been presented, then the pair can agree on the best course of action, but only once they've settled which set of reasons is decisive. Okay, I'm just about out of time, so let me quickly wrap up here. So my conception of the function of reason giving, as I said in the introduction, it rests on a more basic conception of the goal of our epistemic practice, a conception according to which our epistemic practice serves the function of doxastic coordination. Recognition of this fact ultimately, I think, has significant consequences, not just for our understanding of the practice of giving reasons, but for epistemology as a field. What it helps us recognize is that we're born into societies with a pre-existing, what I would call a knowledge commons, a stock of common institutional and factual knowledge, which is inculcated into new members, thereby conferring on them rational agency and enabling them to become contributing members of society. And most of our, what you might call individual knowledge, is actually derived from this knowledge commons, both psychologically and normatively, as our justification for most of what we know will be parasitic on the broader community's justification. So I haven't personally verified that kangaroos are marsupials or that water is H2O. So part of what this means is that we should view knowledge as, in the first instance, a communal resource, and then only derivatively as an individual status or state. So the above conception of the function of our epistemic practice forces a reconception of many core epistemic notions and practices also, including the practice of reason giving and why we give reasons and what the whole function of reason giving is. Reason giving can't just be for individual pursuit of the truth. It has to be seen as something like maintenance of the knowledge commons, producing, maintaining agreement and doxastic coordination. That's the overall bigger picture here. Okay, and I think I'm out of time, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. The floor is open, and let's start with Hillary.
Thanks a lot for that. So until you got to slide 19, the focus of your talk was on doxastic coordination, and I have no doubt that that's an important function of reason giving. But it seemed to play a foundational role in the way that you were thinking about the function of reason giving. And you even contrasted it with the way in which epistemologists often talk as if getting at the truth is really the most fundamental goal. And that seemed odd to me in the following way, not because coordination isn't important, it's crucial for all sorts of things. But when I think about coordination problems, I think about things like this. Say, should I drive on the right side or the left side of the road? Well, I don't much care which side of the road I drive on. What I care about is that I drive on whatever side of the road everybody else is driving on. And when it comes to belief, my attitude isn't, I don't care what I believe as long as I believe whatever everybody else believes. Rather, I actually care about what I believe itself. And that suggests to me that coordination isn't the ultimate goal here, much as it's important to achieve it. More than that, it seems that the way we achieve it is not by aiming for coordination, or at least not primarily so. So, you know, if you and I want to make sure that we're going to arrive someplace at the same time, we might want to, and we talked about watches being unreliable, we might want to check that, you know, our watches both register the same time so that later this afternoon, if we're planning to meet somewhere at a particular time, we both have the same time. But another easy way to do it is, instead of my trying to directly coordinate with you, each of us could coordinate with what we take to be a reliable source. Maybe we check our computers because they are all governed by some, I believe, some common reliable source. And that will achieve coordination, even though I didn't directly, you know, I aimed at just getting the right time. I didn't aim at getting the same time as you, but a byproduct of getting the right time is going to be, if you and I each do it, we'll have the same time. So in general, if each of us aims to get true beliefs, then by and large we'll coordinate without having to aim independently at coordination. But if we aim just at coordination, we won't get truth. And more than that, it seems as if getting whatever belief everybody else has is going to undermine the success of our cooperative enterprises. So it looks to me as if the way in which we should see coordination is very different from the way you were presenting it in the first 19 slides. And we should see coordination, important as it is, as a byproduct of something more fundamental, namely the goal of inquiry as getting at truth. And I don't mean to suggest, by the way, that therefore I'm seeing all this in individualist terms, because I can see the goal of truth as being pursued socially in certain kinds of ways and regulated socially, even while seeing truth as the goal of inquiry rather than coordination.
Yeah, no, that's a comment that I think merits a much longer response than I can give here. I will make a couple of points. I actually don't think that individuals sort of individually pursuing the truth is actually going to lead to coordination. I think you need something like you need an overarching epistemic practice that actually exerts some kind of power on people that is more directive. So, you know, I think about this in terms of the United States, and actually I talked about this at my talk in the Netherlands last week, where you know, one thing you talked about consulting, you know, some authority like on the time. But the problem is that one of the key functions of a society's epistemic practice is to designate authorities, and one function of designating authorities is precisely to secure cross society doxastic coordination, right? So, you know, it would be helpful in the United States if, for example, you know, for a long time, epistemic practice functioned pretty well at getting people to defer to like doctors on vaccine safety or scientists on the danger of chlorofluorocarbons and other environmental toxins. But that epistemic, and so that allowed for coordinated action because people recognize the same authorities. But that epistemic practice is falling apart now because people aren't submitting to that power, as it were, right? And they're saying, well, I'm going to figure things out on my own. Terrible idea for people to try to figure things out on their own, right? The point of the epistemic practice is to create, as I said, to have this inegalitarian of epistemic authority, and you know, ideally this, you know, at the end of the day, this has to be aimed at the truth, but in the interim, right, it has to be it has to produce this kind of doxastic coordination so we can act in concert. And, you know, one of the things that I often think about is Thomas Koons', I think somewhat underappreciated article, The Essential Tension, where he talks about the importance of convergent thinking. Because, you know, when a particular discipline has a paradigm that everybody agrees on, even if it's wrong, that's great, because you're never going to find out that it's wrong unless everyone is working on the same thing and they're absolutely committed to it, right? But, you know, if you have divergent thinking, if everyone's off doing their own thing, he says science makes no progress when it works like that. Science only works when you have convergent thinking. Consensus is absolutely essential to the scientific project, even if it's consensus around something that's wrong. Like I said, there's a ton more to be said about this, I understand.
All right. For those joining us online, if you have a question, please type Q into the chat. And next is Jaco, who already did that. Jaco.
Okay, thank you. That was very interesting. My question concerns sort of the limits of this model of giving and asking for reasons for establishing doxastic agreement. So when we're talking of populations of millions, it's clear that not everyone can exchange reasons with each other directly. So I was wondering if we need, there's of course there are other mechanisms for explaining how doxastic agreement is reached in societies and groups. But I was wondering if for large-scale societies and especially modern societies, we need a completely different mechanism to explain how the agreement, doxastic agreement of millions, for example, concerning who is a good authority on medical issues. How is that reached aside from the reason-giving practices? So is it that for those large-scale issues we need, for example, pure brute political power, or some kind of a mechanism where people's beliefs and what their behavior is affected more by what they believe other people in society believe. So some sort of collective representations and ideologies. Or do you think that we could explain sort of this micro scale agreement by the micro scale agreement of group reasoning in some fashion?
Yeah, and sometimes I wonder, I think, based on reading, people like Mercier and Sperber, sometimes I do wonder if I get the impression that reason giving really works better in kind of and evolved to work better really in much smaller scale groups. And when you transpose this into a society of millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people, then it's kind of out of its element and maybe doesn't work quite as well. But it's not the only or even the best mechanism for consensus maintenance. And as I said in response to my reply to Hillary, society has many mechanisms for consensus maintenance. As I said, there's the differential allocation of epistemic authority, which is really one of the most powerful ones. Most of what we know on the authority of others, and that's really one of the most essential elements of doxastic coordination, is that we generally agree on who those others are and to whom we should defer on what issues. Reason, as I said, reason giving. When reason giving breaks down is when somehow some element of that epistemic practice goes astray, like we quit agreeing on whom we ought to defer to, or when like it's sort of first level agreement breaks down on the basic commitments. So yeah, reason giving is kind of at the end of the day, I think probably sort of a weak reed upon which to lean if your goal is ultimately consensus maintenance. There have to be these other mechanisms in place that are prior to reason giving and which are ultimately more powerful in sort of creating and sustaining this consensus, this agreement. And like I said, I think now we're seeing a lot of these mechanisms break down in certain advanced societies. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it was perhaps a bit vague question also, but yeah, that clarified.
Okay.
I myself have a question, but I don't want to jump the queue. Yes, Molly, please.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed that. I just had a question about whether or not the two dimensions, the extent to which they're like descriptive or evaluative or both, such that would you want to say that a group that's very well coordinated, doxastically coordinated, but really bad when it comes to optimization is like doing something that's epistemically laudable or good? And that's my worry, because I had similar concerns to Hillary in that I wanted to, I understand the coordination dimension, though I see it as like subservient to the optimization dimension, or a way in which we get optimization. Yeah,
and I think that's one of the things to take away from the line that the two of you are pushing is that ultimately the coordination has to serve optimization somehow, right? Because I think that there are ways of seeing coordination around a false alternative as good, right? And again, I wouldn't say that except that I've read Thomas Kuhn, right? Because when he talks about the importance, as I said in response to Hillary's question, when he talks about the importance of convergent thinking, it's only by converging around a false paradigm that you actually make progress. That's how scientific progress is made, is due to this convergent thinking. So, the very fact of convergence is actually the thing that is the driver of progress. So without that convergence, then you wouldn't go anywhere. So it's good in the sense that it moves you toward the goal, right? But I think that's a good way of putting it. The convergence itself has to be seen as sort of instrumental to these other kinds of things.
Thank you.
All right, more questions? We have 1 more minute. Maybe I can ask my question in 1 minute. I'll try to make it quick. So Hutchfield opened his log lectures with this quote that I can't reproduce accurately, but it was something like some 19th century wit saying, no one ever doubted the existence of God until Bishop such and such undertook to prove it. So the idea was, well, sometimes giving and asking for reasons might actually not lead to coordination, but to dissent. Sometimes precisely when we're unaware of something,
Right.
when we ignore something, that's when we're really consenting, because we're ruling out that option even from thought in some way. And so isn't there also a danger of giving and asking for reasons to undermine coordination rather than produce coordination? Isn't reason giving something that we do on the background of the coordination, but doesn't really show up? Like the whole background, there's at least parts of the background that are kind of systematically occluded when we play the game of giving and asking for reasons.
Yeah, I think so, and I'm pretty sure it's. I mean, do you mean like intentionally or just unintentionally?
Unintentionally.
Unintentionally, yeah. Because certainly the intentional uses of that have to be exceptional. I think Mercier and Sperber talk about salesman use of reasonings, which have to be exceptional. But unintentionally, yeah. I mean, that is. Yeah, I think you're right about that. And I guess I don't know what to say about that. Whether we should just say that that's an unfortunate byproduct of an evolutionary trait that otherwise serves a useful function. That it might also serve these unfortunate functions as well. But it just piggybacks along. Yeah, that's something I'd actually have to think about. That's interesting to think that it might also serve the opposite of what it's supposed to, right? And that I'll have to think about whether that's problematic for my thesis.
Okay, great. So before we thank Jeremy, one announcement that I forgot at the start, we have one little change in the schedule. So Michael is not going to make it for the third talk of this session, and instead Pietro has agreed to take that spot so that we can end one talk early today and have a larger break before dinner. But yeah, so next up is Molly, and now let's thank Jeremy for talk. And a 10-minute break.